These are the most interesting historical photos and unusual objects from the past. Let's get 100,000 subscribers. Here you see Adolf Hitler reading during a trip in the late 1930s. In 1939, a member of the Swedish Parliament sent his name to the Nobel Committee as a protest nomination, which was soon withdrawn. Ground crew raised their hands as a US B-17 bomber roars low over an airfield in 1943. A famous story claims one such bomber came back with 11 harmless rounds in its fuel tanks and a hidden check note saying, "This is all we can do for you now." Troops pose on a massive German gun nicknamed Big Bertha, used in World War I to fire huge shells over about 15 kilometers. Its shock wave was so strong that the crew had to stand hundreds of yards away and stuff their ears to protect their hearing. In 1943, United States Airman Owen John Baggett bailed out over Burma and hung under his parachute as a fighter plane circled him. Later reports say he fired his small pistol at the passing cockpit, and the plane went down. Medical students and doctors sit in rising rows while a surgeon works on a patient in the center of an old teaching room. These steep galleries looked like small theaters, which is why a surgery room is still called an operating theater today. Marilyn Monroe is pictured here with baseball star Joe DiMaggio, whose short marriage to her in 1954 became a lifelong bond. After she passed away in 1962, he sent roses to her resting place for about 20 years. This group photo shows Albert Einstein standing among other men, highlighted here by arrows. A popular story says he once told a reporter that to find the smartest person you should ask inventor Nikola Tesla. Early drivers pose with a racing car from the dawn of motorsport, when its speed was closer to a bicycle than a modern car. In the first major United States car race in 1895, the winner averaged about 7 miles per hour on icy roads. Two workers easily carry a bare Porsche sports car shell made from lightweight fiberglass. This early body weighed around 120 kilograms, helping the car reach high speed with a small engine. The photo shows the Taj Mahal Hotel in Mumbai, India, with a horse carriage in front in the early 20th century. During World War I, from 1914 to 1918, this hotel was converted into a 600-bed hospital for soldiers brought from the front. These steel darts, called flechettes, were used in early air combat during World War I and dropped in large numbers from small planes. Falling from high in the air, they could pierce helmets and wooden boards like tiny armor-piercing spikes. After the Battle of Kursk in 1943, thousands of Axis prisoners from many countries march in columns under Soviet guard. Less than 15% were German, and there were so many prisoners that only a few dozen guards were needed. Silent film star Buster Keaton stands perfectly still as a full house front drops around him in a stunt for the 1928 film Steamboat Bill Jr. The open window had only about 5 centimeters of clearance on each side, so the slightest step wrong would have seriously injured him. Police carry young civil rights activist John Lewis away during an arrest in Nashville, Tennessee in 1961. Decades later, he watched Barack Obama become president, and Obama handed him a note that read, "Because of you, John." This photo shows part of Tulsa, Oklahoma, on May 31, 1921, when fires swept through the Greenwood district known as Black Wall Street. Over 1,000 homes and many businesses were destroyed. In 1911, a Czech magazine showed this strange rocket camera, which fired into the sky and took a picture from above as it fell. Long before drones or phone cameras, inventors were already trying to make automatic aerial photos of themselves and their world. A woman calmly fixes her lipstick while a man studies his now stained handkerchief in this 1930s dating advice photo. Magazines of the time warned women that borrowing a man's handkerchief or applying makeup in front of him was bad manners. In 1930, a 4-year-old girl in Delhi named Shanti Devi calmly told her parents she had lived before as a woman called Lugdi in the town of Mathura. When they checked, they found a real Lugdi who had recently died there. In 1959, a prison work gang led by James Carter was recorded singing a song called Po Lazarus, and the tape was stored away for decades. In 2000, the song was used on the soundtrack of a hit film that won a Grammy. In 1982, Larry Walters of Los Angeles tied weather balloons to a lawn chair and unexpectedly soared to about 15,000 feet, drifting into controlled airspace. He caused a short power outage when he came down and was fined $1,500, but his strange flight became legend. A Victorian-era bather lies in a strange curved tub that rocks like a cradle on the bathroom floor. These rocking baths let people slosh the water and gently sway to imitate the feeling of being on the ocean without leaving home. Two inventors in 1919 test an early wireless telephone with a heavy battery box and big tube antennas instead of a small handset. Devices like this showed that voices could travel through the air long before modern mobile phones. In 1940, when France was occupied, Citroën engineers secretly changed the engine oil dipstick mark on trucks built for the German army, so it showed "full" too early. This kept the engines running with too little oil, causing them to fail much faster, while the mechanics never knew why. A French warship hauls alongside an overloaded boat of Armenian refugees in 1915, pulling them up from the rough water. During operations like this, thousands of Armenians were evacuated by French naval ships to safer ports such as Port Said in Egypt. This ruined apartment block is the famous Pavlov's house in Stalingrad, defended by a small Soviet unit in 1942. Surrounded on three sides, they held it for 58 days against repeated German assaults, making it a legend of urban resistance. In 1941, Soviet boys and girls stand in a long line with their suitcases, waiting to be sent from home to work in factories far from the front. While their fathers went to fight, these teenagers became part of the war industry, taking on adult duties with very young faces. This photo recalls the great Chilean earthquake of May 22, 1960, the most powerful quake ever recorded. It reached about 9.5 in magnitude and sent huge waves across the Pacific Ocean. At the Paris Exposition of 1900, visitors glided above the streets on a moving sidewalk called the Rolling Walkway. It carried crowds around the fairgrounds at up to 10 kilometers per hour, a futuristic ride decades before airport walkways. This is Rex, a Soviet messenger dog in World War II, carrying dispatches in a pack on his back. In February 1944, he reportedly swam across the Dnieper River 3 times in one day under heavy fire, was wounded several times during the war. On August 15, 1918, United States troops landed in Vladivostok as part of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. For several years, American soldiers guarded railways and depots in Siberia, a rare moment when United States forces operated on Russian territory. This is Alcatraz Prison on an island in San Francisco Bay, where the shower water was kept warm on purpose. Guards hoped prisoners would get used to warm water, feel the bay as freezing cold, and be scared to try swimming away. After World War II, Berlin was split between East and West, and by 1961, so many East Germans were leaving that the authorities rushed to build the Berlin Wall. From 1949 to 1961, about 2.5 million people had already gone. Amid the ruins of besieged Leningrad, a wall poster urges residents to defend the city while shattered buildings line the street. On November 30, 1943, school children from the Narva district collected and turned in about 5,000 kilograms of shell fragments as scrap metal for the war effort. A woman and 2 children stand in front of the burned ruins of their village home during World War II on the Eastern Front. Scenes like this were common as entire communities were destroyed and millions of civilians were left with nothing but rubble. In winter 1943, Senior Sergeant Moiseev sits outside an Izvekovo log house, gently feeding a 2-year-old girl his unit found alone in an empty hut. Many children were left like this as villages changed hands during the war, and soldiers often tried to care for them on the move. Soviet airmen sit for a relaxed photo in front of the wreck of a German fighter plane during World War II. For them, taking pictures with a downed foreign machine was a quiet way to show they had survived and won in the air. After World War II, Bombed-out buses in Tokyo were turned into tiny homes to ease the city's severe housing shortage. This photo from October 2, 1946, shows people repairing and outfitting the buses as makeshift shelters. On May 2, 1945, 14-year-old regimental son Vladimir Tarnowski climbs onto the Reichstag in Berlin to write on its wall the names of his artillery comrades Doroshenko, Tarnowski, and Sumtsov. He had marched from Slavyansk to Berlin after his mother was killed in the war. A lone man stands in the ruins of Hiroshima in 1945 with the broken dome of the Industrial Promotion Hall rising behind him. The city was almost completely flattened by a single wartime explosion, and this shattered building was later kept as a memorial to the people who once lived there. Inventor Otto Rovetter stands with his automatic bread slicing and wrapping machine, built in the late 1920s. By 1933, sliced bread had spread so fast that people started saying something amazing was the greatest thing since sliced bread. In 1986, a snake expert in India spent 72 hours inside a cage with 72 venomous snakes, calmly sitting among them. He wanted to show they strike mainly when they feel in danger, and he walked out without a single bite. In the 1930s, showman Egon Heinemann toured fairs with the Headless Woman, an illusion where a living performer appeared to sit calmly without a head while tubes and machines seemed to keep her alive. Hidden mirrors and chambers made the trick work. American troops stand by a captured coastal gun at Battery Crisbeck in Normandy in 1944. Its concrete shell still mostly intact. Days later, an ammunition blast shattered the bunker and sealed in the German crew. Joyce Brothers, a young psychologist, shocked television in 1955 by winning the game show The 64,000 Question on the subject of boxing. Producers had tried to stop her by asking extra difficult questions, but she had memorized fighters. In the late 19th century, it was normal for little boys and girls to wear the same kind of white dresses until about 6 or 7 years old. Around the time before World War I, advice guides often suggested pink for boys as a strong color and blue for girls as a soft, delicate shade. A family of sharecroppers stands barefoot outside their small wooden cabin in Troup County, Georgia, around 1930. Families like this worked long days on land they did not own, often ending each year still in debt to the landowner's store. In 1879, American inventor Mary Walton patented a way to cut train smoke by running it through water before it went into the air. She later designed a noise-reducing system for New York City's elevated trains after Thomas Edison could not solve the problem. Andrew Carnegie started as a mill worker's helper in 1848, earning just $1.20 a week, and later built the biggest steel company in the United States. After selling it in 1901, he gave away most of his fortune to create about 2,500 public libraries around the world. Kim Ung-yong from South Korea was a child prodigy who could read several languages as a toddler, solve advanced math on television, and studied physics at university before age 5. He later earned a doctorate while still a teenager, reportedly scored above 200 on IQ tests. A large family stands barefoot outside their wooden house in Pike County, Kentucky, around 1910, showing everyday life in rural Appalachia. Many families here lived from small farms or coal work, raising numerous children in simple 1- or 2-room homes. A team of horses and wagons hauls a full wooden house that has been lifted onto skids, ready to slide it to a new spot. In the early 1900s, house movers regularly shifted entire homes this way, using only jacks, beams, and animal power. In the 1950s, a Texas oil man kept a full-grown lion as a family pet that walked around the house and even let the children ride on its back. The animal lived with them for years like a giant house cat, and reportedly died of old age. During the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, many people in the Western Netherlands survived by eating tulip bulbs instead of throwing them away. Families boiled or ground the bulbs into flour when normal food supplies were cut off. In 1937, photographer John Cowles posed his brother George and friend Roland Senfton having a calm picnic on top of balanced rock, hundreds of feet above the ground. The soda company they hoped would buy the picture said no. This street scene shows old Chinatown on Southwest 2nd Avenue in Portland, Oregon, around 1900, crowded with shoppers, workers, and kids. At that time, the Chinese community here was thriving despite harsh exclusion laws, filling the blocks with shops, cafes. Japanese-American families stand in line at a camp during World War II, many forced to leave farms and businesses behind. One California man, Bob Fletcher, quietly ran the farms of 3 such families, paid their debts, and handed everything back to them after the war. This photo shows a Dosco NCB dint header, a huge rotating cutting head used in coal mines to carve very low tunnels. Machines like this were built for retreat mining, shaving the roof and floor as crews backed out of an exhausted seam. In January 1936, black sharecropper families on the Dibble Plantation near Parkin, Arkansas, were put off their homes after the parents joined the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. With nowhere to go, many of these children and their parents had to live by the roadside. Frontier saloon girls in the American West were hired mainly to pour drinks, play music, dance, and keep lonely miners spending money in the bar. In many boomtowns, they earned far more than most men and were treated as local celebrities, carefully protected by the saloon owners. In 1945, American trucks roll into Florence loaded with crates of Renaissance masterpieces that German forces had removed and hidden in the Alps. This mission, led by Allied art protection teams, returned thousands of paintings and sculptures to their original Italian museums. This photo shows Tokyo in ruins after one of the great fires and air raids of the 1940s. For centuries, from the early 1600s to 1945, the city was repeatedly wrecked by fires, earthquakes, and war, forcing it to rebuild again and again. American planes did drop millions of warning leaflets over Japanese cities in 1945, telling people to leave key industrial areas before large air raids. But historians point out there is no solid proof that Hiroshima itself got a specific leaflet warning before the new type of weapon was used there. German pre-dreadnought battleship SMS Hildebrand, already decommissioned and used as a hulk, ran aground on Scheveningen Beach in the Netherlands during a storm on 21 December 1919 while under tow for scrapping, quickly becoming a local tourist attraction. During the last years of the war, special attack pilots were told they could return to base if they did not find a target. One pilot came back 9 times and, according to reports, was then executed by his own officers for failing his mission. During the Vietnam War, U.S. forces ran Operation Wandering Soul, blasting loudspeaker recordings of ghostly voices said to be from fallen Viet Cong to exploit local beliefs about restless spirits. These eerie sounds were played at night in the jungle to confuse, frighten. During World War II, the Soviet Army trained dogs with explosives to run under enemy tanks and disable them. Because the dogs were trained using Soviet vehicles, on real battlefields they often ran toward familiar Soviet tanks instead, causing dangerous friendly fire accidents. In winter 1925, when a diphtheria outbreak hit Nome, Alaska, and no medicine was left, 20 mushers and about 150 sled dogs formed a relay and rushed antitoxin 674 miles in just 5.5 days through blizzards and deep cold. Decades ago, this dirt track near Charlotte, North Carolina was packed with race fans, roaring engines, and Saturday night lights. Today, the same grandstands sit cracked and overgrown, a ghostly stadium where nature has quietly taken back the speedway. In 1929, Amelia Earhart tested the Ruggles Orientator, a wild mechanical cage that flipped riders to mimic the spins and loops of stunt flying. It was one of the earliest flight simulators, letting ordinary people feel a tiny piece of what pilots did in the sky. Around 1910, workers at the Pendleton Woolen Mills in Oregon lined up on the loading dock, each wrapped in the factory's own patterned blankets, while a child posed in the window above them. The company's bold wool designs, inspired by Native American patterns. Around 1910, Loggers in southern Oregon used long teams of oxen like this to drag huge timber out of the woods before trucks and forest rail lines existed. Each animal added just enough pulling power to inch those massive logs downhill towards sawmills that were feeding America's growing cities. In 1912, 23-year-old pilot Silas Christopherson shocked Portland by flying his homemade biplane off the roof of the Multnomah Hotel during the Rose Festival, with crowds packed on the streets below. The runway was only about 30 meters long. In 1924, a line of U.S. Navy Curtiss H-16 flying boats rests on the Willamette River in Portland, Oregon, part of a visiting squadron showing off America's new long-range seaplanes. These twin-engine giants had started as World War I patrol craft and now served for training, coastal patrol. On 7 May 1937, the day after the Hindenburg burned at Lakehurst, investigators walk among the twisted metal frame of the German airship LZ-129. The loss of 36 people and this haunting wreck on the sand effectively ended the dream of luxury passenger travel by giant airship. On 10 June 1914, huge gas balloons lifted off from the Rose Festival Fairgrounds in Portland, Oregon, for the Great Oregon Balloon Race, watched by thousands of spectators. These early racing balloons had no engines at all. The pilots steered only by changing altitude to catch different wind currents. Celilo Falls on the Columbia River once dropped about 73 feet in spring floods, filling this canyon with thunder and spray. For thousands of years, it was a major native fishing site, until the falls disappeared underwater after a dam was built in 1957. During World War I, British engineers experimented with mounting a Vickers machine gun on a pack horse so the weapon and its heavy water-cooling gear could move with cavalry. The idea looked dramatic in tests, but in real combat, the system proved too heavy and unstable. This strange Churchill bobbin tank is one of Hobart's funnies, unrolling a giant reinforced carpet so other vehicles would not sink into soft sand during Allied beach landings. The idea came after the failed Dieppe raid in 1942, when many tanks were lost simply because the beach surface could not carry their weight. In July 1941, British Home Guard volunteers in Suffolk learned to fire the Northover projector, a crude anti-tank launcher made from steel pipe that hurled Molotov-style bombs. Costing only a few pounds each, these improvised weapons showed how seriously Britain took invasion fears. The Victorian experimental submarine Resurgam was built in 1879 by British inventor and clergyman George Garrett as one of the first practical powered subs. In 1880, it sank in Liverpool Bay while under tow to Navy trials, and its wreck was only found again in 1995. Italian and Austro-Hungarian troops fought along ridgelines over 3,000 meters high, turning the Alps into frozen trenches above the clouds. On this White War front, ice, avalanches, and extreme cold caused more losses than direct enemy fire. In 1982, a RAF Avro Vulcan returning from a Falkland strike ran short on fuel and had to divert to Rio de Janeiro, where it was intercepted by a Brazilian F-5 and landed still carrying a live Shrike missile. When Brazilian controllers asked where the mysterious Delta jet was from, the crew jokingly replied, "Huddersfield." In April 1943, a Vought OS-2 Kingfisher battles rough seas as it taxis in to be hoisted back aboard the battleship South Dakota after a scouting flight. These small float planes were the ship's eyes over the horizon and often rescued downed airmen. On the 4th of June 1942, sailors on the carrier USS Yorktown hurry across a sharply tilting flight deck as the ship lies severely damaged during the Battle of Midway. After multiple hits left her dead in the water, the famous carrier that had just fought at Coral Sea was being prepared for abandonment while other U.S. carriers carried on the fight. An elderly veteran of the 9th Texas Infantry stands with the worn flag his regiment carried through Shiloh, Perryville, Stones River, and Chickamauga. The same banner later went with them into the Atlanta campaign, making it a rare survivor of many major Western theater battles of the American Civil War. In June 1944, sailors from the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal stormed the crippled German submarine U-505 off the coast of West Africa, seizing codebooks, machines, and the boat itself. It became the first enemy warship taken at sea by the U.S. Navy since the War of 1812. In the early 1900s, Winchester Cathedral began sinking into the soft marsh beneath it, so diver William Walker spent 5 years alone under the flooded foundations, working by touch in dark water. He placed around 25,000 bags of concrete, 115,000 concrete blocks, and 900,000 bricks. In 1913, 10-year-old Sarah Rector was given a worthless 160-acre allotment in Oklahoma because the good farmland was kept for white settlers. When a massive oil well struck her land, she began earning thousands of dollars a day and became one of the first black millionaires in the United States. In 1918, young Red Cross ambulance driver Ernest Hemingway fell for nurse Agnes von Kurowski while recovering from his wounds in Italy. Their brief romance later became the heart of his novel, A Farewell to Arms, where she inspired the heroine, Catherine Barclay. In 1978, actor Anthony Daniels appeared in full C-3PO costume to conduct the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall as they played the Star Wars score. The LSO had recorded the original soundtrack only a year earlier, so the robot on the podium was leading the very orchestra that gave the saga its famous music. Japanese intelligence officer Hiru Onoda stayed hidden on a Philippine island until 1974, sure that the conflict had never ended. He finally came out only after his former commander flew in and formally ordered him to stand down, 29 years after 1945. In the early 1960s, the original TV game show The Price is Right sometimes offered wild top prizes, like a small airplane, a one-man submarine, a swimming pool, or even a house in Florida. The producers used these huge headline-grabbing giveaways to pull in viewers and turn a simple price-guessing game into one of the flashiest shows on television. On Christmas Day 1914, British and German soldiers on the Western Front briefly left their trenches, shook hands in no man's land, and shared food, songs, and games. This unofficial Christmas truce became one of the most striking moments of humanity in the middle of the First World War. In February 1947, the village of Snag in Yukon recorded about -64 degrees Celsius, one of the coldest temperatures ever measured in North America. Air was so dense that voices carried for miles, and river ice cracked with sharp booms that echoed through the frozen town. On the night of 14th November 1940, an air raid set Goulson Library on Cuckoo Lane ablaze, leaving only its shattered shell on the street. Inside, about 20,000 reference books were destroyed in hours, wiping out a whole city's store of carefully collected knowledge. In 1912, English amateur Charles Dawson presented the Piltdown Man, a mix of a medieval human skull and an orangutan jaw that experts welcomed as the long-awaited missing link. Only in 1953 did new tests reveal the bones had been stained and filed by hand. Early 20th century cadets stand in a muddy field while senior officers walk the line, checking every uniform and stance. Scenes like this show how strict drills were used to turn school-age boys into disciplined future soldiers, long before they knew what real combat was. In the Ustasha-run Lobograd camp in Croatia, Serb and Jewish women and children lived in bare wooden barracks, while the youngest girls were preyed on by guards, some forced into pregnancy at only 14 years old. In Viking society, a wife could legally end a marriage if her husband insulted her, was overly jealous, refused to share her bed, or dressed in a way seen as unmanly, like wearing low-cut shirts. Compared to many later European laws, these rules gave Norse women surprising power over their own marriages. In the late 1960s, American boys barely out of high school lined up like this to swear the induction oath for the draft, often just weeks after graduation. Many of these 18 and 19-year-olds were quickly sent thousands of miles away to serve in Vietnam instead of starting college or regular jobs. In a mid-20th century Sears catalog, this auto strap cost $1.88 and was advertised so toddlers could sit, stand, kneel, or sleep in the front seat while the car was moving. Early car safety for kids was often just a harness tied to the seat frame, long before modern child seats. The text on this image is a modern myth. Historians find no record that Rockefeller paid scientists in 1892 to invent the term fossil fuel, and geologists do not consider oil an endlessly renewing liquid. In reality, most crude oil formed from ancient plants and sea life over millions of years. Among traditional Inuit, serious arguments could be settled with song duels, where rivals mocked each other in clever, satirical verses before the whole community. Whoever earned the most laughs and support was judged the winner, letting tension dissolve without violence. In 1914, these Inuit children sit in a boarding school dining hall under a sign that says, "Please do not speak Eskimo," a quiet order to drop their own language. Across the Arctic and North America, such schools pushed Native kids to use only English. In 1965, at the Cannes Film Festival, John Lennon and his wife Cynthia are photographed at a table while a full Dalek prop from the film Doctor Who and the Daleks rolls up behind them. Director Richard Lester was there with his new movie, The Knack and How to Get It. Edith Cavell was a British nurse in World War I who treated wounded soldiers from every side and quietly helped more than 200 Allied troops escape German-occupied Belgium. In 1915, she was condemned by a German military court for this underground work and paid for her courage with her life. 19-year-old Lydia Martinez ran a 4,500-ton hydraulic press on the night shift in a 1940s aircraft factory, using her perfect pitch to hear tiny changes in the machine's hum. She could spot stressed metal by sound alone, helping keep hundreds of planes safe in the sky. During Prohibition in the 1920s, American doctors could legally prescribe whiskey, wine, or brandy as medicine for everything from anxiety to the flu. Pharmacies filled millions of these prescriptions, helping turn chains like Walgreens into booming businesses built on medical alcohol. Russian Old Believer Karp Lykov took his family deep into the Siberian forest in 1936, building a log cabin about 250 kilometers from the nearest village to escape religious pressure. For 42 years, they grew potatoes and hemp, wove their own cloth. In the late Cold War, the United States built the W-54, a tiny nuclear bomb light enough for special forces to carry in a backpack or in this man-portable case. Despite its small size and suitcase look, its blast was equal to up to about 20 tons of TNT, designed to be dropped by paratroopers on enemy targets. Dina Sanichar, the Indian wolf boy, often linked to the real-life Mowgli, was found in 1867 running on all fours with a pack of wolves. Missionaries later taught him to walk upright, wear clothes, and eat cooked food, but he never learned to speak. Swiss explorer Xavier Mertz squeezes out of a roof hatch because his Antarctic hut has been buried so deep in snow that the original doors are useless. He was part of Douglas Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition of 1911 to 1914. After the siege of Leningrad, restorers at the Hermitage and Russian Museum carefully cleaned soot from priceless art, while outside bricklayers rebuilt the shattered streets. These quiet scenes from 1945 to 1950 show a city slowly rising from ruins, trading artillery echoes for the sound of hammers. This man sits locked into a heavy wooden keng, a traditional Chinese punishment collar that publicly displayed a prisoner's name and offense while making even basic movement difficult. In the late 19th century, such collars could weigh dozens of kilos. 10 Lysenko brothers from a Ukrainian farming family all went to the front in World War II, an almost unheard-of case where every single brother came back alive. Here in their later years, they walked through the fields together. In 1966, a British inventor built Tinker, a working home robot that could trundle around the house, deliver newspapers, and even serve drinks to guests. This clunky metal helper was an early glimpse of the futuristic smart home people dreamed about decades before robots became real products. Before electric fridges, men spent winter days sawing huge blocks of ice from frozen rivers and lakes, then hauling them out by hand. These crystal blocks were packed in sawdust and shipped around the world, including to warm cities, where they kept food cold for months. In 1933, filmmakers used tiny stop-motion models, glass paintings, and a full-size log set to create this famous bridge scene in King Kong, making audiences believe a giant ape was really hurling men into a jungle abyss. The groundbreaking effects by Willis O'Brien were so advanced for their time that many later monster and adventure movies copied the same tricks for decades. These women from the Azores Islands are wearing the traditional capote e capello, a heavy wool cape with a huge, stiff hood that almost hides the face. The odd shape shielded women from Atlantic wind and rain while also giving them privacy. 3 Soviet women stand in their rubber aprons at the entrance of a workshop, captured not as heroes of posters, but as real, tired professionals of everyday industry. Photographer Vladimir Lagrange used scenes like this in the 1960s thaw era to quietly replace stiff propaganda with honest glimpses of working-class life. A barefoot boy leans against barrels in London's East End. One of the street children, Thomas Barnardo, met in Whitechapel in the late 1800s. Seeing kids like him sleeping outside every night pushed Barnardo to open homes and ragged schools that educated thousands of destitute children across Britain. German prisoners of war shuffled down Berlin's Friedrichstrasse in May 1945, passing the ruins of the capital just days after the city surrendered. Civilians watch in silence as the last soldiers of the collapsed Third Reich are marched away to Soviet camps. In 1945, Canadian troops ordered local German civilians to dig and prepare graves for people who had died in nearby camps, forcing the townsfolk to confront the human cost of the regime they had lived under. This somber line of men and women with shovels, captured by Life magazine. Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, nieces of the Queen Mother, were quietly placed in a long-term hospital in the 1940s and even listed as dead in official family records while still alive. Decades later, their hidden story resurfaced, sparking public anger. In the Normandy village of Leeville in 1944, French resistance fighters seized Juliette Odive, accused of helping the German occupiers. Scenes like this were repeated all over newly liberated France, as neighbors suddenly turned into judges of who had stood on the wrong side of the war. In the 1950s, American South, a mother and her baby sit under a sign reading, "For colored patrons only," a reminder that local law forced black riders to the back of the bus. Scenes like this repeated every day in buses, schools, and cafes. In 1955, Marilyn Monroe was photographed on set, taking a break to read James Joyce, showing how much time she spent with serious books between shoots. Behind the famous image of a blonde icon in a bikini was a woman who owned a personal library of hundreds of challenging titles. A rare 1877 tintype shows Billy the Kid in the tall top hat, calmly playing cards in a New Mexico saloon, long before he became a legend of the Wild West. At only about 17 here, he was already known as a quick shot and drifter whose name would soon spread across frontier newspapers. Lieutenant Commander Donald D. Shepard of the U.S. Navy draws a fiberglass bow and fires a flaming arrow at a bamboo hut along a Vietnamese river in 1967, relying on skills from his days as a champion archer. Great Britain's ice hockey team celebrates its shot gold medal at the 1936 Winter Olympics in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, defeating the heavily favored Canadians on an outdoor rink. Most of the British players were actually Canadian-born dual nationals. The Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop, pose on the Las Vegas Strip in front of the Sands Marquee, advertising their legendary Copa Room run, where they'd sing, joke, and roast each other on stage deep into the night. Smiling calmly for the camera in 1936, former geisha Sada Abe had just been arrested in Tokyo for a notorious crime of passion that shocked the entire country. She later became a dark legend in Japanese pop culture, inspiring books and films that turned her strange obsession with love. In this staged indoor test, Lieutenants Frank Ballou and Samuel Peterson empty their revolvers into a brand-new steel shield, while its proud inventor, Elliot Wisbrod, crouches behind it as the ultimate proof that he trusts his own design. A small, shy 5-year-old Vladimir sits on the lap of his mother Maria in a simple Leningrad garden, long before anyone imagined his name would be known far beyond this yard. The worn sandals, homemade dress, and strawberry patch capture how modest. Former Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo sits under guard at the Tokyo Tribunal, listening through headphones as every word is translated for him. In this chamber, he was found guilty for leading Japan into the Pacific conflict and received a death sentence that was carried out on 23 December 1948. A young Jim Jones leads a children's choir at a small Methodist church in Somerset, Indiana, in 1953, looking like any earnest local preacher. No one in this room could guess that this soft-spoken pastor would later build the People's Temple. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, Private First Class Res P. Hester grabs a few minutes of sleep in a sandy foxhole while his Doberman, Butch, keeps silent watch over the darkness. These Marine war dogs could smell movement long before humans could see it, warning patrols, finding wounded men. In 1940, before the United States entered the conflict, Fortune magazine asked Americans if a German victory over France and Britain would threaten them, and almost 2/3 answered yes. The bold infographic turns that anxiety into blocks and cartoons, showing Uncle Sam trying to farm in peace, while public opinion quietly admits that distance across the ocean is not real protection. A Chinese farmer named Hung Chin Chi kneels alone in front of a people's court in Fukang in the year 1953, while villagers are forced to watch the show trial. In a few minutes, this public ritual will end with him condemned and taken away, a warning to everyone of what happened to those labeled enemies of the new rule. Former Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss is led by Polish guards to the gallows at the camp in 1947. He had been sentenced to death after a post-war trial in Poland for crimes committed at the site. A soldier of the 25th Infantry Division climbs out of a Viet Cong tunnel in Vietnam, October 1967. These tunnel rats crawled into dark, narrow passages filled with traps and hidden supplies to map and clear the underground networks. Ludmila Pavlichenko, known as Lady Death, was a Soviet sniper photographed here in 1942. By the end of the Second World War, she was officially credited with 309 confirmed enemy hits, making her the most successful woman sniper in history. Marine biologist William Beebe squeezes out of his tiny steel bathysphere after a record dive off Bermuda in August 1934. In this ball, barely big enough for 2 people, he became the first human to see deep sea life more than 3,000 feet below the surface. This is a 4,000-year-old classroom in ancient Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq, where students sat on mud benches in rows. Here they learned to read and write cuneiform on clay tablets in one of the oldest known schoolrooms on Earth. James Gregory sits for a formal portrait on 18 July 1920, the day he became the first black police officer in Morristown, New Jersey. His polished suit and steady gaze show how serious this moment was in a town where law enforcement had always been run by white officers. On 9 February 1920, a railroad worker decorated his letter home with a tiny cartoon of himself writing at a desk, dreaming of being a real cartoonist. He never drew for newspapers, but envelopes like this turned his everyday mail into a small art gallery traveling across America. Baghdad City Center, on 15 August 1919, still looks calm and busy with carts, carriages, and pedestrians, far from the front lines of the recent world conflict. The mix of domed buildings, arcades, and a European-style street clock shows a city balancing old Ottoman roots with new modern influences. On 28 December 1920, young Amelia Earhart took a short passenger flight that instantly hooked her on aviation and pushed her toward record-breaking solo journeys. 16 years later, during an around-the-world attempt in 1937, her plane vanished over the Pacific and the mystery has never been fully solved. A young woman construction worker calmly tests steel beams high above the city streets in 1920 with no harness or safety net. Women were just starting to break into trades like this, and photos like this showed how fearless some were about working at extreme heights. Shoppers pack a liquor store on 15 January 1920, grabbing the last legal bottles before national prohibition begins in the United States. In the days around this photo, many families quietly filled their cellars, turning normal basements into hidden home bars for the long, dry years ahead. In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stands before Congress asking permission to enter the Great War against Germany. With this speech, the United States shifts from distant observer to a key power whose soldiers and factories will help decide how the war ends. On 3 April 1920, writer Francis Scott Fitzgerald married Zelda Sayer in New York, just 8 days after his first novel, This Side of Paradise, turned him into a star. Their whirlwind marriage and party-loving style would soon define the jazz age and inspire the glamorous, restless women in his stories. On 17 January 1920, Chicago police line up with crates of seized bottles and barrels on the very first day of the national ban on drink sales. This staged photo was meant to show victory, but it really marked the start of a huge underground trade that would make gangsters rich for the next decade. On 25 November 1919, Italian opera star Luisa Tetrazzini arrives in New York aboard the liner Mauretania in full fur coat and dramatic hat. Her voice was so famous that a popular American pasta dish, turkey tetrazzini, was named in her honor. On 4 June 1920, the Hungarian delegation walks to the Grand Trianon Palace to sign the treaty that ends their part in the First World War. With one document, Hungary lost around 2/3 of its land and millions of its people to neighboring states, a shock that shaped its politics for decades. On 25 December 1916, these British soldiers turned a shell crater on the Western Front into a makeshift dining room for Christmas dinner. A simple cloth, tins of food, and a wooden cross in the background show how they tried to keep a sense of home. On 1 June 1921, smoke rises over Greenwood in Tulsa as white mobs set the prosperous black neighborhood known as Black Wall Street ablaze. In less than 2 days, homes, churches, and businesses were wiped from the map. Polish officer Witold Pilecki deliberately let German police arrest him in Warsaw in 1940, so he would be sent inside the German-run site at Auschwitz. From there, he built a secret resistance network and sent some of the first detailed reports about the horrors inside to the Allies before escaping nearly 3 years later. The 1949 Nash Air Flight had seats that folded into a full sleeping area, turning the car into a rolling bedroom for road trips. Nash Motors had already shocked buyers back in 1936 by advertising this car bed idea, long before modern camper vans and SUVs. 4 of the 20th century's sharpest minds strolled together in 1954. Albert Einstein, Hideki Yukawa, John Wheeler, and Homi Bhabha. Between them, they helped create modern quantum theory, the idea of black holes, and the foundations of both Japanese. A young woman plays a harp above a packed crowd on the Rock of Cashel in Ireland around 1910. The harp, already a powerful symbol of Irish identity, turns this ruined fortress into an open-air stage for the island's growing cultural revival. Children in Sydney wear strange padded air raid hoods in 1942, covering their ears and giving them a bar to bite so they would not hurt their tongues during blasts. In wartime schools, even the youngest kids joined air raid drills, so gear like this became part of normal daily life. British pilot Douglas Bader, who had both legs amputated after a pre-war crash, climbs into his Spitfire using his metal prosthetic legs. Despite this, he became one of the famous Royal Air Force aces of the Battle of Britain, so respected that the Germans once allowed a replacement artificial leg to be dropped to him by air. Aeroflot once gave passengers this tiny liner pack with 3 filter cigarettes as an in-flight extra in 1969, back when smoking on planes was normal. The long, slim box was made to slide easily into a pocket or seat tray. a small souvenir of the jet age in the USSR. In 1913, these bachelors stood outside a frontier bar under a hand-painted "Wives Wanted" sign, hoping passing women would choose a husband on the spot. Some even held cats in their arms, an early cute pet trick to look softer and more appealing. A hereditary roofer in England bought a used car with no top for £25 and then discovered a proper roof would cost £45. So he did the obvious thing for a thatcher. He built a full straw roof for his car, turning it into a rolling cottage. Grand Duchess Anastasia, daughter of the last Russian Emperor Nicholas II, made this mirror self-portrait in 1914 with a simple box camera. More than 70 years before front phone cameras, the teenage princess already wrote to a friend that taking this picture of myself was hard because her hands were shaking while she held the camera. In 1955, motorcycle couriers in the United States wore gas masks to work in thick city smog as exhaust and factory smoke turned the air into a gray haze. Photos like this later helped push city leaders toward stricter clean air rules and serious smog control. During the First World War, women in this workshop sculpt fake heads from papier-mâché and paint them to look like real soldiers. These decoy heads were raised above the trench to lure enemy marksmen into revealing their positions so they could be mapped and avoided. In 1972, the radical Austrian collective Haus Rucker Co. attached this giant plastic bubble, called Oasis No. 7, to a museum in Kassel, Germany. Inside the floating room were palm trees and seats, a tiny utopia in the sky that asked how people might live apart from noisy city life. In 1966, young women in London marched with signs saying "Miniskirts forever" to protest designers who wanted hemlines to drop again. The miniskirt had become a symbol of youth style and freedom, and these girls were not ready to give it up. Young members of the Komsomol in 1930s Ukraine dig into a cemetery grave, not for a body, but to pull out sacks of grain hidden there by local farmers. During collectivization, searches for hidden food went so far that even graveyards were checked for every stored kernel. In October 1917, the famous dancer and accused spy Mata Hari stood alone before a French military firing squad in a quiet field near Paris. Minutes later, she was gone, leaving behind one of the most debated and mysterious spy cases of the First World War. In Victorian London, petty market thieves could be locked into these heavy wooden footstocks in public as a living warning to others. This 1872 photo shows two boys and an official beside the device, where offenders might spend hours on display while crowds passed by. In 1942, German occupation authorities gathered thousands of church bells in Prague, tagging each one before shipping them off as scrap metal. Most were melted down to feed the war industry, leaving many towns suddenly silent without their familiar ringing. Workers picked through the mound of rubble left after the Cathedral of Christ the Savior was blown up in Moscow in 1931. The stone from this giant church was carted away for new building projects, including the planned Palace of Soviets that was never completed. 4 stylish young women in the early 1930s drink from bottles in a row, a quiet challenge to the idea that only men should be seen enjoying beer. Their neat dresses, hats, and handbags say, "Respectable ladies," but their relaxed pose shows a new generation breaking old rules of behavior and freedom.